There we go. Yep, perfect.
Okay, perfect.
Awesome.
Sorry, y'all. That was one of those faux pas. But in any case, yes, I am the creator of Squawk, and we'll understand what that is in just a second. Really intended to help improve feedback. You'll find that it improves feedback in design and research and product. But I think folks also, as some of the people who've been using it have said, it helps even at home. So we'll take a look at this feedback formula. So I wanted to speak a little bit about feedback. Feedback's really kind of tricky because you can hear a lot of things. You can be there's the side of the feedback giver who really needs to construct their input and insights in a way that we can understand and act on them. And that is what the intention of Squawk is to really help drive better alignment between what people say and what their ideas are that they want to express to us as designers or as UXers. And then how do we as UXers really hear that feedback and interpret it a little bit more concretely, if you will, a little bit more action oriented. Typically, when I talk about feedback, there's folks who've experienced things that aren't so great. Like, how many times have we heard where someone just says, I don't like that? And that tends to be someone who's kind of shouting that they don't like it. And they don't necessarily know how to help you fix it or even how to express what they don't like about it. And sometimes people will just say, I don't think that'll work. And that tends to be folks who have a lot of the data. Maybe they've got a lot of the tribal knowledge. They've been around a while and they've tried everything. And it seems like they have some evidence that helps you understand, nope, this is just not going to flat out work. And sometimes you hear people say, why did you do it that way? And when we hear that as a feedback recipient, that question of why actually it's a question that in literally every language that's spoken today makes us defensive. It's like all of a sudden we have to defend why we made a choice the way we did. And so when someone is giving you feedback and they're asking you why, they're actually unintentionally, maybe intentionally putting you on the defensive. So we'll talk about maybe better ways of asking questions. There's also folks who really are just, hey, can't we just do it like this competitor? I've got this great idea. There's other people who are doing this. Isn't this easy, right? It's just a line to plop it out, do it exactly like the competitor does. And then surprisingly, we even get situations where you're doing a great job. And that tends to be kind of circular. Like, we're doing a great job, but we don't know why we're doing a great job. We don't know what we need to amplify. What is it that you liked, or what is it that worked effectively so that I can amplify that and do a better job next time? And this is where kind of Squawk came to be. And I'll tell you a little bit of an origin story of Squawk, and then I'll tell you what, of course, Squawk stands for. But when I was leaving one company and had given my 2-week notice, the team had a mobile app that we were kind of revealing and getting feedback on along the way. And this was the final kind of meeting that I was going to be in. And my peers across all sorts of different disciplines, from engineering and product and legal, just really expressed a whole lot of different ideas and a whole lot of well-intended, positive intent things that my former design team was going to have to listen to and figure out how to act on, and what really was necessary to improve that app. And I felt kind of a little sick because I realized that there was a disconnect between what well-intended stakeholders were trying to convey to this team, and there was a disconnect. They didn't quite understand how to convey that information and then how to absorb it. And so between these two jobs, I sat down, gave myself this 100-word challenge. I've done this throughout my career, and this one really kind of stuck as something that I think is going to be successful, and it has been. And what it was is I came up with, sat down and thought about, how do we close this gap between feedback givers and feedback recipients? What's a better way of giving feedback? And came up with 6 categories that account for 74 words. So if you counted the words on this page, it'd be 74. So I like to kudo myself and say, wow, I've got a 24% surplus of words. We're going to go through and talk about each one of these from a feedback giver perspective, and then also a feedback recipient perspective. And if we have time, we got started a little late, might also be able to tell you a little bit about kind of each of these categories mascots, if you will. If you think about how many times you've been in a feedback session and it feels like squawking birds, chirping out requirements and just screeching things, I've kind of reinterpreted some of those birds to really represent each of these categories. And hopefully we'll get a chance to kind of break down and you'll understand why that yellow stork represents suggestions. So let me go through this process of helping us understand how do we provide feedback. And when we are designers or researchers or product folks, we are also responsible for providing feedback to others as well. We're not just the recipients. Net, what I'm trying to say is almost in every situation, every single job, I can't actually think of any job in which you're not responsible for collecting feedback and acting on feedback from others. So that means we're also feedback providers in multiple situations. So let's learn a little bit about how to use the Squawk framework formula to provide feedback. We'll start with suggestion, which is a comment or idea based on opinions or experiences. What this really is, when you look at the formula there that our stork is holding, it's do this thing, do make this action happen. And then as the feedback provider, I'm obligated to explain why that's an important thing to do. What is it that makes that suggestion so persuasive and important? I'm not allowed to actually just say, I don't like this. Really need to describe, how do you fix this thing? What is it that you need to do? And how can I be so compelling in my suggestion that yes, you as the maker of the work, right, the UX person, are going to say, yeah, that's a great suggestion. I think I'll take that and adopt it into this work. So when I'm a feedback giver, the key thing here that I really need to highlight is explaining why. Why is this suggestion really going to be helpful for this work and for this UX person who's doing this work? And helping people understand they don't just have an opinion or an experience. Their suggestion is based upon that, but they really need to turn on that persuasion. Next is the question, right? And we have a quail who represents the questions. This is just an area that needs clarity or exploration. And if I'm a feedback giver, what I'm going to try to do is help you understand, if I'm asking a question, that the type of question that I'm asking is, this is something that I need clarity on in order to understand your work. Please answer this question. Or I'm going to also help you understand, maybe this is a question that I'm trying to help spur or inspire a different type of thinking. I'm really trying to challenge you to maybe get out of the box that you're in or to think beyond the boundaries. So I'm taking responsibility for helping you understand kind of the type of question that I'm answering or that I'm asking and what I hope you will do with that question. This one's a little bit different when you're a feedback recipient, but I'll get to that in just a second. Next is user signal. And this is really the data, feedback, or research that spurs that compelling suggestion or an authentic kudo. And when I'm a stakeholder giving feedback about someone's work, I think it's really great when I'm able to go back and look at all of the data, all of the signal that we've received, and I'm able to give that more compelling, more persuasive suggestion because I've been a part of collecting that user signal. I know what our users are doing and what's important to them. And it's even better when I'm able to give a very specific kudo to you as well, because I know, wow, this is going to actually solve a significant user problem. And I'm able to pull in that data. So I'm trying to use that user signal that's collected through data analytics, your feedback sessions, your usability testing, all of those tools that we use with Maze's help to inform our product and design decisions. And I, as a feedback giver, I'm really harvesting that same information to strengthen my suggestions and make that kudo even feel better because I know that it's tied directly to users. Accident is one of my favorite. This is just identifying a typo, copy and paste error, these things that you're doing really in prototypes early on, and you might be moving so quickly that you're you're likely going to commit some of these accidents. What's great about the formula that our Alabaster is holding is there's a lot of discretion. This is a situation in which if I'm a feedback provider, I'm really wanting to identify those things, but I'm not going to bring it up in a critique session. I'm not going to bring it up and voice it in front of people. What I'm really committing to is I want to highlight this, circle it, or send you a chat, a text message or something that says, hey, you've misspelled something. This is not something that we need to talk about. It's really something that I can just share with you and trust that it's going to get fixed. And I can't tell you how many folks have really appreciated the idea of not having to talk about these very simple mistakes that don't take any debate, that it's just, let me know about it and I'll fix it. Not a problem. I have several personal conversations with people who I've been able to help kind of talk out of verbally expressing accidents by giving them the opportunity to just trust that I'm going to fix these. And it cuts down on so much kind of noise in the system. Next is critical. And this is a problem that must be resolved because of the potential business risk or customer pain. But what's nice about this in that formula is that, again, I'm going to say, do this thing. I'm going to be persuasive and help you understand why. But most importantly, if this is a critical issue that must be resolved, I'm going to offer help, guidance, commitment. I'm there with you to figure out what is it going to take to fix this really serious, critical problem. I can't express that it's a critical if I'm not there to help you solve it. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of that commitment might be. Sometimes it's easier than having to move a mountain. And lastly is kudos. And this is really just praise or gratitude, sincere and specific. When I'm giving kudos, I really want to make sure that the person understands what is it that really has worked effectively so that they know to do more of that. One question that I typically will get about kudos is it's interesting that I didn't include time. And what I've discovered over my career is you can express a kudo to someone weeks, years later than when they actually did that thing. You can express that kudo at any time, and people are going to be really appreciative of hearing that, especially if it's sincere and it's specific. It really highlights what is that behavior or what is that feature or item that really knocked it out of the ballpark and was representative of doing a great job. So I don't put timely on here. Timely would be really nice to hear those kudos immediately, but it's great just to hear them even later on. Kudos, it's never too late, I guess you could say, to hear a kudo. That's kind of the summary from the perspective of giving feedback. There's lots of best practices in a book that I've written, the Squawk to Improve Feedback, that goes into more details. And I've got another book coming out that's about kind of the stakeholder perspective too. So there's lots of content around that. And I'm happy to take questions in a few minutes about ways of really structuring your feedback so that the recipient understands it. Now I'd like to think about it though from that other side. If you've got your work out there and someone is squawking it, they're giving you feedback, what's the best way for you to actually act on it? And the formulas are the same. This looks pretty similar. I'm hearing feedback. What's that suggestion? And when someone has given you their suggestions, some of the best practices for hearing them is to recognize you own what you do with that suggestion, right? You own whether you're going to accept that suggestion, whether you're going to not, you're going to avoid that suggestion, or maybe even delay that suggestion. You own it because what you're responsible for is making sure that you respond to the suggestion, that you acknowledge it, that you treat it as this precious thing, right? The stork is kind of the purveyor of babies, right? They bring in the babies, that's in mythological and a lot of cartoons, And if you're hearing suggestions, you need to kind of consider that suggestion as something that's precious as well, and recognize that you're going to need to consider those suggestions and respond back, and let the feedback giver know what you're going to do with it. Respect it, consider it, and then close the loop and let them know if you're going to take action on it, if you're going to not take action on it, and explain why. And maybe you're just going to delay. It's not going to get into this sprint, it's going to get into the next sprint. It's really important to just acknowledge to people that you've heard their suggestion. It becomes a win-win situation that way. As far as questions, again, it's the same formula, but this time, think about it from, is the person asking the question because they need critical information, or they need information to understand my deliverable, whether it's a prototype or a research plan or research results or even a product roadmap? Or is it something that they're encouraging me to explore? And what's important here is really think about, how was the question actually framed for me? If it's a yes/no question, try to answer that with a yes/no answer. If it's a what question, answer the what. Don't explain the why. Try to build that rapport with the feedback giver by really focusing on hearing what it is they're asking about and what's important, what appears to be important to them. If you can answer that question that they need the answer to, you're gonna build a better rapport with them, and you'll maybe be able to share more information, more background for them as well. Where this becomes really important, I kind of dig in a little bit here, is I've managed user experience teams for many, many years. And sometimes you hear teams working with, all of the other disciplines, and you've come up with this solution that is going to meet the timelines, is going to meet all of the technical constraints, and it'll deliver the right user experience. And you've grappled with a lot of things. And then you're asked a question about whether that's the right design or not, or what's the right timeline, or what are the technical constraints. And I've noticed that user experience people might answer those questions, but really think about whether the question that's being asked is for you as the designer, or if it's really intended for some of your product peers, or your engineering peers, or marketing peers, and they have the authority and the right to answer that question as well. So it's really thinking through recognize that this is a question, think about what type of question it is, whether the feedback provider needs the answer now, or if they're just kind of trying to challenge you to think a little bit differently, and then consider, who's the right person to answer that question? Is this really a part of my work? Is it a part of the team's work? Who's the right person? And it's really kind of giving over the opportunity for others to speak up for the power of their discipline as well. Lots of best practices about this. User signal, again, this is, are you using user signal to help drive your decisions? One of the most exciting things to me from a UX management perspective is when I hear my peers, my stakeholders, right, the team stakeholders using that user signal. That means that we've done a really effective job sharing that rationale behind why we're making the decisions we've done and what user challenges we're going to solve with these designs. And so it's really exciting to know that we've communicated that very effectively. What's great too is when you start to hear, people leveraging it and giving us kudos and helping recognize to the designers and the UX folks, yeah, we're going to solve this user pain and this user problem. When I am also thinking about it, when you're giving the context of your design or the context of your work, it's really helpful to pull in the user signal and share that as part of your context setting as well. So you can use user signal to help define and defend and kind of rationalize your decisions as well. Probably very familiar with doing that, but it's kind of nice to know that you can reflect upon feedback and use that feedback from users to help defend and define and share the rationale behind your design decisions too. Accidents, it's great to hear the accidents, right? Kind of discreetly. As a feedback recipient, really super, super important for you to fix them, right? Make sure that if someone's taking the time to identify an accident, that you fix it. But not fixing it is what causes it to become a conversation and a topic that is discussed instead of shared discreetly. So just a couple of best practices there are fix the problem. And then also if you identify that you've got a stakeholder who's really proud of the fact that they find those accidents. I've worked with a few of those folks in my career who are just really, really kind of, they get an ego, right? It's one of those things they're most proud of is of finding spelling errors or finding where things are not perfectly aligned. What may help in that is instead of sharing it with them in front of a whole group during design critique, you might take them aside, give them the opportunity to kind of do their QA work individually, knowing that you're going to fix the problems before you get it out to the broader design group or in addition to. Sometimes I've actually kind of, there's one particular woman I know who's just so kind of enamored of finding very fixable problems. And I've given her a separate access and have asked her to go through and identify them and really kudo her and congratulate her and appreciate her for finding those accidents that I can then fix really easily. And then it does not become a conversation. Sometimes people will actually might mention an accident. I'll tell a little story in which we were all sitting around doing our annual planning, strategic planning, and every one of the product managers had written, a document about what we were working on in the next year. And we were all in this room together and we were going to be really debating and prioritizing. And the first thing that one of my peers did was just mention that there was a misspelled word in a headline in the header of the document. And literally 3 people mentioned, that's just an accident, give it to her later, she'll fix it. And it set the conversation, reminded him, he's kind of, wow, that's great. Yeah, I'd forgotten that I don't have to bring this up in front of the group. And the fact that 3 people kind of corrected that behavior, he was able to just move on to much more important topics that we needed to debate. So the accident is something that is really valuable to help people understand. Just highlight those, give those to me, and we'll take care of them. I'll take care of them later, offline. And a lot of times your stakeholders really appreciate knowing that there's a place for providing those accidents or sharing those accidents as well. Critical. It's really helpful to know when you're getting a lot of feedback to know which ones are most important or which ones are going to cause that business risk or customer pain. When someone has expressed a critical to you, ask them, what's the guidance that you need? Ask them for where to find those resources or who they need to talk to. That's a really important question of who else is going to find this to be an important issue that I need help to resolve. What you've done there is you've broadened the conversation and you may have more people willing to help you solve that problem. So it's an opportunity to follow up, make sure that you understand what the critical is, what the nature of that critical issue is. It helps with prioritization. And you're also looking for your counterparts, your partners who are going to help you solve that as well. And lastly, kudos. It seems like an easy thing to do to accept kudos. One of the things that I've noted is sometimes someone will give you a kudo and the inclination is to say, oh, it's not as good as it could have been, or gee, it was because of you that I was able to do a great job. And one of my best kind of tips around this is if that's kind of you're going in where you kind of maybe you don't necessarily know how to accept kudos, is take a deep breath or swallow, right? If someone is giving you a kudo, if you just take the second to swallow, you're going to be more accepting of that kudo. And when you are more accepting of the kudo, you're actually more respectful of the person who's giving you that congratulations and that gratitude. What I've noted sometimes is that if you don't actually respond effectively when someone is telling you you've done a great job and here's why, they may be less inclined to give you that information later because you're not necessarily knowing how to accept them. So remember that. Try to think about that kudo from their side and how it needs to land, and help them understand that that was really great to hear, and that you're going to practice that again. You're going to amplify that technique or that behavior that they're sharing with you. I thought it might be kind of fun to do a little bit of practicing. Seems like it's only 74 words, but how do you put it into action? And so there's a situation in which every year we get kind of the world's worst websites, right? Gratefully, as far as I know, none of the work that I've done has ever been on one of these lists of the world's worst. But I like them because they're kind of blunt and they're kind of cruel and funny, right? They're all written for entertainment. But if you think about it from the perspective of, would you as a designer know what actions to take based upon, being nominated to the world's worst website? And it's kind of an idea of, hey, let's take something that is intended for entertainment, intended not to be showing that you're a partner, and can we actually rewrite it using Squawk? And so I'm going to spend just a couple minutes on this in terms of, here is a website, the world's worst. It was nominated to the world's worst website for last century, right? This is from the late 1990s. So I figure I'm probably not insulting anyone who may have worked at Disney, and this is not your design right now. Here's what was said when it made it onto the list. The original description was, we're drawn to the site's double bottom navigation system, a must-have navigation system for 90s websites. On the one hand, you've got your whimsical wave of navigation links. On the other, you've got your bottom navigation bar, which looks a little odd with its links displayed in that brown maroon color. Disney also seems to have gone all out on fonts in the 90s, employing over 6 different fonts just for the homepage. And yes, we are the logo police. Check out poor Mickey Mouse. If you were the design team for this site, you might read this and think, but how do I fix it? This isn't really being collaborative. I don't feel like this is a partnership. What are the things I can really do here, right? I understand that you're unhappy about things, but it's not helping me actually take action. So let's explore this a little bit, and let's rewrite it using Squawk, one of those words. Let's take the first sentence. I'm not going to read it again. I loved reading it just because it's so blunt and so mean. But let's just take that first little paragraph and think right now, what is this person, this feedback provider, trying to convey? Is it a suggestion, a question, user signal, accident, critical, or kudos? I'll give you just a couple seconds to kind of absorb it, think about it. How might you rephrase it? And then more words. I'm suggesting that that first paragraph is actually 2 different suggestions. Now, these are very wordy. I recognize that I'm trying to be very explicit, right? In writing the suggestion, I'm trying to kind of show what it takes to make an effective suggestion, but let's take a couple of these and talk through them. So here we go. Because the page has so many redundant links, calling them out, right? Being specific, let's remove the links in this way. The remaining links, which are not part of the image, will be easier for screen readers to identify, which will enable visually impaired customers to use the site as well. And what I've done there, if I'm really trying to partner with that design team that created this page, I don't like this, or I find a problem with this navigation, but I'm also trying to help them understand why my suggestion is better. And in this case, trying to improve it for visually impaired customers, right? That's that persuasive element, trying to really tie it into our audience, right? The people who might be visually impaired and wanting to use the Disney website. The second suggestion that the person could rewrite using Squawk is, since customers may struggle to identify this brown navigation, right? Maybe we should go back to the industry standard and use the blue links. There again, I'm trying to be persuasive. I'm trying to suggest that I don't just not like this color, but there's a reason why we might go back to the industry standard at the time, which was blue underlined links. Why are we, really kind of questioning, why are we doing something that's outside of the industry best practice? Those two suggestions, I think, are a little bit more actionable, a little bit clearer, and something that, as a feedback recipient, I'm more likely to pay attention to than someone who's just kind of complaining about, the navigation system for the 90s and not really being helpful to me to understand what actions I should take. We'll move on to the next sentence. So again, this is just, Disney seems to have gone all out for fonts in the 90s. If you're thinking about how would you use Squawk to change that? What would that be? Would it be a suggestion, a question, critical? What is there? And in this case, I again think that I would translate it as a suggestion. And again, try to be persuasive to increase the legibility of the page. Let's eliminate fonts that are difficult to read. The table of contents and removing the weighted navigation links will help. I suggest eliminating a couple more fonts for even better legibility. I'm trying to tie it to something. What is the intent of this suggestion? It's not just based upon my opinion. It's really based upon wanting to convey an improvement and make it actionable. Going to the last one, the logo police, I believe this actually could be a critical. Let's call this out as something that absolutely needs to be fixed. After all, Disney has made a huge investment in the Mickey Mouse logo. And here you'll find that I'm also, as the feedback giver, telling them where to go and find those web optimized logos and images. I'm committed to helping the designer of this solve this problem. It was a critical, but it's a pretty simple fix. And I'm here to kind of partner with you to make that happen. Of course, I also can't help but think there's other feedback that I would love to give, right? Like what happens when users tap on where Merry Magic is in the air? What's going on there? I want to understand. It's critical for me to, or not critical, I shouldn't say critical. It's important for me to understand what happens with those. I'm trying to convey that I need to understand that in order to be able to provide better feedback to you. So my question is just, what happens when users are tapping on this? And I'm going to try to clarify that helps me understand the overall site. Moving on to another kind of my Squawk feedback, not the original world's worst websites. Also want to understand what did the usability participants expect when they selected that fun link. I don't think it's pointing to the right thing, but how well did we meet their expectations? And here I'm kind of using my question to convey that usability participants are really important too, right? I want to understand what was the user signal behind that, and are we meeting that expectation? I'm kind of helping the designer explore what was the intent there? What were we striving to accomplish? My question is now a little bit more actionable. Yeah, we can go back or say we didn't usability test it, or were we successful or not? And then kind of lastly, there's kind of, I want to give kudos, right? There's a reason Squawk ends in a K, and it's so that I always remember to reinforce things that are working. And in this case, it's really showcasing our areas of business. I'm assuming this, I never have worked at Disney, but trying to be specific and trying to be sincere in, wow, you really understand the business of Disney. And what I'm trying to do as a feedback provider there is really help the designer understand, yep, these are really important things. In fact, maybe the next design is going to even take that a little bit more deeply or convey that even more. I have that opportunity to convey compelling information and convey to the designer what needs to still occur and happen. And so then there's just, great, you've got kind of some practice, you understood the categories, but what about hatching Squawk across your team? And I've just got maybe 3 or 4 minutes, I think, before we're probably going to break out into questions. Typically, people have a lot of questions to ask, but let me just go through this really quickly. One of the things that I would do is schedule a Squawk session. Reserve 60 minutes of time. That sounds like a lot with your stakeholders, but it helps for them to really get practicing Squawk. Try to make it after deadlines. Don't make it something that they're having to do before a prototype is due or before a launch date happens, right? Include multiple disciplines. And then there's lots of logistics to consider for in-person, remote, and hybrid meetings, and how to enable the people to provide and categorize their feedback. A couple of things that are important are, I think it's important to really tie Squawk to your particular team's needs. So is there a way for you to kind of write a summary about feedback, right? A summary of feedback about feedback. And that may come from, going back to your retrospectives, or have there been situations where maybe your stakeholders have given feedback but it hasn't been acted on and they're kind of frustrated. Maybe there's surveys and complaints. Maybe you all as UXers are a bit frustrated that you get feedback that's not helpful. It comes at the wrong time and it's not really work that you can take in at that time. You're too far into the product life cycle to be able to accommodate some of those suggestions. And so pull some of that information together into a short summary so that people can recognize, I've experienced that. And maybe this Squawk feedback formula can help resolve it. Talk about what's worked and what's not worked. And then this is just kind of this is a summary of lots of words on this page, but just trying to kind of templatize how do you kick this off in your organization and make a proposal, about how to give each other actionable feedback. Pull in paragraph B, right? That feedback that you've heard, what's not working, what's getting frustrating, and can you actually make it into a value proposition? What's our goal in using Squawk? What's the problems, the user signal, if you will, that you're trying to solve? Because people have not been accommodating or haven't gotten what they wanted out of the Squawk, out of the feedback sessions, right? And maybe reinforce where it's worked before. Maybe reinforce, I've seen people say this, that they've read a book or that they've attended one of my workshops, right? And they're able to pull that in to give it, reinforce the goal and help people recognize the value of this shared vocabulary, right? And if you give this out to people in the meeting and say, please read this little cheat sheet, right? Once they've read this document, right, and they've squawked it, signal that they're done. When everyone's done, we'll go through. I'm really interested in targeting questions and suggestions. I'm open to all Squawk feedback about this one document, right? So we're actually squawking about something that is not tied to our work. And what you're doing is you're helping them use Squawk on Squawk. And kind of funny, but if you can get them using the terminology and the vocabulary before they even recognize it, it's much more likely to be adopted. And then in your Squawk session, right, just a few highlighted steps here is, try to send the document out in advance, explain the logistics. Is it going to be Post-it notes? Is it going to be, in Figma, where you're actually just calling out and categorizing your feedback, setting a timer, right? Let people Squawk individually. That's really important. Let people kind of take a little bit of that ownership of categorizing their feedback and getting familiar with those categories. And then, great, timer goes off, people are done. Ask if there's any overarching Squawk feedback of your item. And then what's really important as the person who's receiving the feedback is make sure you understand. And it's important for you to look at the criticals. Those are the ones that are in red, right? That's why it's critical. That's why it's red. Make sure that you understand them. Make sure that you understand the questions and the suggestions. Read through what you can if you're posting it in Figma or whatever tools that you use. And your first thing is to really just make sure that you understand. You are not necessarily in that Squawk session required to respond. You need time to think about it. You need time to think about those suggestions and figure out what the critical process is going to be, or what the process is going to be to solve those criticals, right? Make sure that you kudo the attendees and you set expectations for follow-up actions. Whew, lots of talking here. Couple of other things to really incubate and hatch Squawk is align it to your existing ceremonies, or maybe you need to invent new ones, right? Create Squawk habits. When you're giving feedback, call it out. Say that this is just a suggestion, or this is my suggestion, or I have a question. And then role model it in every interaction that you're doing. Call it out. Help people understand what your intent is in providing that feedback. And with that, I'll say questions, or maybe more importantly, any squawk about Squawk?
Amazing.
Kind of turn it over to you, Ash.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Julie. Yeah, feel free to take a drink if you need. It was a great session, very comprehensive on the framework. It's funny, I think I may have mentioned this to you before, but very reminiscent of, I think there was an article or something that had circulated a while ago about like the different types of animal characters in the room. I think like the rhino, and I think it was making a comparison to the different types of personalities in stakeholders, and it's very reminiscent of that, and all the animals on the O'Reilly books. So I don't think we'll have time to go into the decision making that for all the birds, but I love that tidbit.
For sure, the one that is, I think, probably most reminiscent, the stork I had mentioned a little bit, right? Think of those suggestions as being really precious. The kingfisher for the kudos is really important too, because the kingfisher fish actually kind of hovers above things and is very intentional about when they make a dive in to get a fish. And I kind of like that as when you're thinking about congratulating someone or giving them praise and gratification, it's like, think about it. What's important for that person to actually hear? Be intentional about your kudos, because then they're going to be more memorable and they're going to be more meaningful to people. So I think about it from that very patient, very intentional kingfisher when they're fishing, right? They're trying to catch their prey.
I love that metaphor and symbology, because I think, a lot of times too, I think maybe we've all received feedback of this kind before, where it almost feels like, just the slap on at the end. We've been even in environments where it's been like the shit sandwich, as they say, where it's just like kind of sandwiched in there, and it doesn't allow you to point out specifically what that person should do more of.
Exactly.
It just kind of slaps it on at the end. So yeah, I appreciate that. We've got time for a couple of questions. The first one I wanted to get to actually comes from the audience. So Samantha asks, would love to know if Julie, if you're familiar with the 6 hats method. Squawk seems like it is very similar.
Gosh, I haven't thought about the 6 hats methods. You might have to refresh my memory a little bit. That's really where you are approaching a problem from 6 different kind of perspectives, right? I think that Squawk actually is a little bit different in terms of trying to convey your feedback a little bit more directly. But I'm going to have to go back and look at the 6 hats methods and see how much it does overlap.
Yeah, I think it's cool how there's like, just different frameworks and pieces, people that you can kind of pick and choose, how this best applies, because, right. Sometimes, as you were talking about, like implementing this into a team and organization is only best when it's not like shoehorned in, but is actually retrofit specifically to the ways in which your team works and operates, maybe what ceremonies you already have in place. Yeah, so that actually led me to a question. So at Maze, we're entirely distributed. we work entirely remotely. And so a lot of our communication, especially in feedback across, design and product, happens in asynchronous modalities. So, I might give or receive feedback in lots of channels. It might be in Slack, that might even be in text versus Huddle. It might be over a Zoom call in a co-design session. It might be in Notion. It might be in a Google Doc if we're talking about copy. So lots of different channels. And one way, this is two parts of a question. One thing is, how do you communicate kind of effectively given the difference in maybe receiving that information in a live environment through talking maybe versus in text? And the other would be, the different kinds of people that we work with, right? Like, I know as an American, I come off as a very direct but passionate kind of person, and that might be different to someone who doesn't come from that cultural background. So anything that you could kind of maybe leave us with in terms of those different types of environments?
Yeah, so I could probably have a very lengthy answer, so I'll try to be brief. But there's a couple of situations in which Squawk has worked really effectively in terms of kind of cross-discipline and cross very different kind of cultural backgrounds, because it's really, there's no difficult words in it, right? It's 74 words. And what it has done is it actually, I've heard people say it's very empowering. I've had data scientists, especially, who have said, they felt kind of guilty at having an opinion about design because they don't understand, visual design. They don't understand kind of our expertise, but it gives them the kind of the opportunity and the authority to say, this is just a suggestion. It's based upon my experience, my expertise, and it enables them to convey that, knowing that the designer is going to do the right thing, right? And likewise, the designers don't know anything about Python or artificial intelligence, but we still have an ability to react to something. And using this vocabulary and being able to structure your suggestions appropriately makes it just so much more palatable on the recipient side as well. And I've also seen, so that's kind of across disciplines, and we've seen that happen verbally when we've had meetings where it's just, wait, I'm gonna squawk this really quick. I've got a question, I've got a suggestion, and calling out what your categories are. And then also in written feedback, it just really helps to put that, preface it with an S if it's a suggestion, right? It's not that important, it's not a critical, but just something to consider. I've also seen where folks have a situation where I worked with a woman who was really quiet, much more of an introvert. And yet when she spoke, you really needed to pay attention because she had a position that was important. And what she loved about Squawk, and it might have been quoted on the first page, was, when I say that something's critical, all I have to do is say, I don't have to raise my voice. I don't have to like pump up or anything. I don't have to act like I'm not American living in Amsterdam, right? and all she does is she says, I say it's a critical, and it brings about a very important perspective. It's like, oh, we need to pay attention to this. And now let's just get on with the fix. This is critical. Now let's figure out how to fix it. And it made it feel she's more empowered. And she doesn't have to get out of her comfort zone of having to kind of pump up and be anything more than what she is. She's kind of quiet, and yet she's very influential, and it helps her convey those important things, those critical things that way.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think one of the biggest takeaways that I had is just, kind of being able to implement this from like a vocabulary standpoint. Even just shared language like this helps, on the receiver end. I know if I'm getting this from a critical stakeholder that it's a very, very important thing to them, versus if it's something that's, not as critical. It helps me have the gauge on where they're coming from, and then also for them to be able to signal, in that direction, like what is important.
I've got a story about that where, I had a design team that worked kind of made it very much like you, where some of our design standards were owned by another team. And we were kind of, pioneers. We wanted to do things differently. And we were constantly going through with our design reviews with this team. And we wanted to be able to leverage patterns that already existed, because our kind of the thing that we were disrupting was something a little bit different. And our first initial interactions with them were they thought everything needed to be changed and everything was super important. And when we introduced Squawk, it actually helped them understand. It's like, oh, no, this is not a critical issue. This one's not critical. We would like you to change this. We'd like to express this as a suggestion. And it helped them actually do a better job. And they'll admit to this in documenting the requirements, right? The standards, and where to be a little bit more lax on the guidelines. And we really cemented a much better working relationship with them because we better understood what is most critical to them as they're implementing these enterprise-wide standards, versus where they could give us a little bit more flexibility. And it really strengthened those critical standards for them. It helps them recognize, oh, why is this a critical?
Yeah, self-reflection. So, it kind of puts the pause in the person who's providing the feedback to make sure that they're thinking about it, or intentionally, thinking about it, and has a framework to be able to provide it. This has been great. I know we have some other questions in the chat. I would encourage folks, if you want to, we connected with Julie ahead of time, and she graciously will kind of pop into the post inside of Circle. So if you want to bring any of your questions to that post, the recording will be posted there. And then any of your questions that weren't answered today, Julie can kind of pop in asynchronously and provide some more context. So I appreciate everybody. Thank you so much for just the graciousness in the beginning for us kind of getting the technicalities figured out, and for your time and attention today with us. Thank you so much, Julie, for providing the comprehensiveness with Squawk. It's really been super beneficial. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week. And Julie, I'm just giving it a couple of seconds because there's actually a delay between when the session cuts off. So I'm just going to give it a few more minutes and then I'll end the session.
Worries. And you might have to remind me where to go. I know I agreed to do it, but I'm not sure where it is.
I'll let you know for sure. Yeah.